What was it like growing up with talent?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I don't think that I don't think I got it. I don't think I had any idea that my childhood was different than anyone else's until I was a young pianist living in New York, and I was teaching for the first time. And I was teaching little kids, and I understood the vast difference between a child who's naturally drawn to make music and a child who's not. And all of a sudden, my own childhood started taking on this very different meaning for me because I understood how much I had loved music from the very beginning.
Can you talk a little bit about your early lessons?
I remember with great fondness my first teacher who I came to when I was, I think, 5 years old, Maria Sizik. She was a teacher who had just come to the San Francisco Conservatory from New York, from Mannes, I think, and she had a sort of a new approach, a new program for working with very young children. So I was one of the first students that she took, and I mean, she was, she was like a second mom. I just adored her, and I remember my lessons. I remember the cover of the Bartok book that she used with me with those beautiful folk drawings. I mean, it was a very, very close relationship. It was a very, very important relationship, and I think that she taught me so much about not just learning the pieces and moving on. That's something that I see a lot with little kids, that the goal is, you learn your piece, you check it off, you move on. I think that from the very beginning, she taught me about living with a piece of music, about learning the notes, and then there was so much more, and about understanding the piece of music and thinking about where it came from and why. So really, that was formative. And in my early teens, I worked with two great teachers, Adolf Bahler, who is an Austrian pianist who was teaching at Stanford, and Rhea Sadowski, who was teaching in Berkeley, a Levine student. She was in her 80s at that time. I came to her and she said, "Well, that's very beautiful. Let's teach you some technique." And she made me work so hard for a few years there, just merciless. And thank goodness she did. I was one of those players. I was one of those kids who was. I mean, I had a good touch at the piano. I had this nice touch, and everything was easy. And I think, some bad habits developed, and she just said, "All right." And, it was double thirds and double sixths and all the yucky stuff for a while there. And she really, really whipped me into shape. And then my family went off to Europe, and we were studying there for many years.
How has the world of pianism changed since you were a student?
It takes a different kind of a musician, maybe, because I think that all of us who are successful in bringing our work to the public are having to do it from multiple perspectives, and it's not enough just to play really well. I think you have to have an idea about the kind of work that you want to do and how you want to do it and how you want to present it. I think that there has to be a strong element of curatorship and of education and outreach and networking, and I mean a lot of skills that go into being a well-rounded musician today. So I would say that's probably the biggest change. It's just maybe it's a slightly different animal, the performing musician today.
Talk a little bit about your performance works and your inspiration for them.
Well, this is something, I think the way that I perform today has evolved over maybe the last 10 years. And I think what I've come to realize is that what's important to me about music is that music tells stories. I see myself, as being able to tell those stories to an audience. And that can be anything. That can be the story behind the music itself, the story of the composer, the story of the composer's world. It can be the story of how that piece of music ties into other cultural elements of the time. I mean, a lot of things. But I think that the desire to communicate that has really informed how I put together programs and how I present them. And I would say that began, it's about 10 years ago now, when I devised a program called The American Century. And the inspiration for that was an exhibit that I saw at the Guggenheim Museum in New York, which was this retrospective of American 20th century art. But rather than being just room after room of paintings, it was curated in a way that every artwork had context around it in terms of other multidisciplinary influences. So, there was just a very different story around a painting by Edward Hopper than there would be if you just saw it on the wall. And I sort of had this understanding of how everything was tying together to create the history of American art in the 20th century in terms of politics and history and cultural shifts and literature and music, and how, this was all one big picture. And that really made me think a lot about how that would translate in terms of the American music. So I put together, it was actually a 4-part recital series, and it was everything from, the turn of the 20th century until the end of the century. And I tried to do the same thing, where I was really relating each piece of music to the time in which it came to be. And that was sort of a revolution for me, just in terms of the way that I saw the music and the way I understood it and the way I was able to interpret it. So I think that desire to include the story has informed everything that I've done since then.
Ryan Brown wrote a variation just for you in the Goldberg. Would you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so Ryan is a young composer. He's based in Princeton right now. And he had composed a piece for the Young Artist program that I direct at the Mondavi Center at UC Davis. And he had sort of a tall order with this commission because it was meant to be a piece that would be premiered on what we call the debut series by a wonderful young pianist named Kenrick Tam. But it was also meant to be used as an audition piece for a young artist competition, which meant that pianists from the age of 8 to 18 were going to be playing it. So he had to think about, different technical capabilities and interpretive capabilities. And he came up with this charming piece that was, it was actually, it was as difficult as he wanted to make it, is what we saw during these auditions, that it was a different thing for an 8-year-old than for an 18-year-old. It was really well written. But what I loved about it was that he wrote it all in the top 2 octaves of the piano. And all of a sudden, when everything is focused way up at top, you're hearing this totally different soundscape and, picking up so much more information about that top register than you do when it's just part of the full spectrum. And that to me was really interesting. And so as I was putting together the Goldberg project, I said, you know what, Ryan, write me one of those little tinkly things, make me a tinkly variation. And then I loved it because, the Goldberg aria itself is centered right in the middle of the keyboard. And a lot of the variations, of course, tend to be there as well. There are a couple. There's the Stanley Walden variation that uses the outer registers. But a lot of it is central. And so I thought it was such a nice diversion from that to then all of a sudden jump way up top and have this. It's very airy and bell-like. It's beautiful.
How did you go about ordering the new variations on the CD?
Well, the set was premiered in 2004 by Gil Kalish, and he determined the ordering for that performance because the variations just came in one at a time, and there was no set order, so he needed to make a determination about a performance order. And he says that he put in a lot of time, to find something that felt logical and cohesive for him. And when I heard his performance, it was a wonderful performance, but somehow in the context of making a recording, the ordering that he had worked out did not feel right to me. And I spent a lot of time thinking about what would feel right and why, and I came to the decision that what I wanted to do is to start with the Bach and make this kind of arc that would move musically, stylistically, further and further away from the original and back to it. So that meant that the more abstract, the more fragmented variations ended up right in the middle. And so I was trying to start from a place where the variations were seeming closer to Bach in terms of their style, their just general language, and then moving farther away from that. I don't know. There were a lot of things. I'm trying to create some contrast, also in mood and tempo, and it's interesting because the pieces are not meant to be interdependent. They're very independent and they stand on their own. But of course, in the context of a recording, your ear at the end of each track, is waiting for the next thing. So keeping that in mind meant that I felt like each one had to lead to something that felt like the next logical step.
Well, thank you so much. And,
thank you.
Stay in touch and let me know what's next.
I will. Take care.
You too. Bye.